Shabbat Shalom. So those who were at my Torah class this week will note that I made a mistake and jumped ahead a week. So we did Bamidbar. So we're going to actually do Bamidbar twice, 2 weeks in a row because of my mistake. And I don't want to go backwards. But today I'm going to not discuss Bamidbar. Instead, today I'll discuss Bechukotai, which is the correct reading as we heard today. The end of the book of Leviticus. We've completed our deep dive into the laws of the priests and also a deep dive into Jewish ethics, which we saw in the last few weeks, especially in Kedoshim, but a bit in Emor. And then we had all the warnings this morning, whether we lived an ethical life or not. And finally, we come to the end, Hazak, Hazak, V'nit Hazek, and we're strengthened by these words. And now next week, we'll jump right back into the more narrative aspects of the Torah as we're standing again at Sinai, ready to move into the desert and pretty quickly get to the promised land. Now, in the reading today, as we heard, it includes both blessings, a really short bit, and curses, a really long bit. The rabbis tell us that we need a lot more curses because when a parent is teaching the children, if you say good things and they're longer than the bad things, then the kids don't hear the bad things. So you have the warnings, they're much longer because that's what scares the kids and hopefully gets them into line. I'm not sure I agree totally with the rabbis, but that's what we have in the Torah. But as you heard, we do it really quietly because we actually don't want God to remember all those promises about the bad things. But just before Ben went into the long chanting of the curses, there was an interesting bit of words that Rabbi Roller referred to briefly in his introduction. So it says, I will establish my abode with you in your midst. I will not spurn you. I will be ever present in your midst. I will be your God and you shall be my people. Now, that translation is a little creative because in verse 12, that's 11 and 12, in verse 12, but it says, Behit halachti, which they translate as I will be ever present in your midst because they don't like anthropomorphism, but it really means I'm going to walk in your midst. And that is a much stronger kind of phrase for me than saying I'm going to be ever present in your midst. I actually don't know what that means, but I do know what walking means. It's an easier word for me. So I was thinking about that a lot. And what does it mean that God is walking in our midst? Well, we do have a few cases in the Torah where the rabbis pick up on the idea of God walking with people. And it talks about people who are generally tzaddikim, and it weighs them a little bit. So when it says that God walks with Noah, the rabbis see that as a little bit negative. Noah needs God to be right there with him, impelling Noah what to do. God has to be in a sense, the senior partner. But it talks about Moses walking before God, and for the rabbis, that's a much stronger kind of metaphor, because there, Moses knows what to do, and therefore, in some ways, becomes the senior partner. But what I was interested in, and I looked at a number of places, was I couldn't find an ancient commentary on this verse that really talked about God walking with us, either in the negative or in the positive. It really wasn't something that they were interested in. They were interested in God being in our midst, and that's a metaphor we find in Exodus, B'shachanti b'tocham, quite a number of times. It's the essence of the word Mishkan, which is the tabernacle that the people had in their midst. But they're not really interested until very, very late in the word Behit halachti. And there I found a commentary in a late Hasidic text, and there it was very interesting because the Rebbe who wrote the commentary didn't look at it as negative or positive. Well, he looked at it definitely as positive, but he didn't pick up on those earlier readings of God walking with either Moses or Noah. Instead, the rabbi picked up on the idea that when you're walking with someone, it implies relationship and it implies reciprocality. And so this text reminds us that God is there for us to connect with, God is there to walk with, God is wherever we look if we open our eyes. God is ready and willing for relationship. Now, it's interesting, in our liturgy, we pick up a lot on this idea of a reciprocal relationship with God. And so we have Ahavat Olam or Ahava Rabbah, great is God's love, or the like, that comes right before the Shema. Then we have the Shema, which is an affirmation of God's unity. And then we go right into V'ahavta, you shall love. So the first prayer talks about God's love for us, and the prayer after the Shema talks about our love for God. And the rabbis pick up on that as an idea of reciprocality again, that our love, that God's love for us requires a response by us, or encourages a response by us, that we too need to show love. Love connects with love. And we know that in our human relationships as well. And it's interesting, there is a Hasidic custom that one does not say Amen after Ahavat Olam or Ahava Rabbah, because then, if we don't say Amen, then the love of God flows right into the Shema, right into you shall love your God, that there's no break between our love, God's love for us, and our love for God. And so the rabbi was picking up on that here, saying that love is the essence and relationship is the essence. And every moment and every time when we try to make the world, the Takein Olam B'Malchut Shaddai, to reflect God's love and God's presence and make that a reality in the world, then we have an opportunity to find God and to find love and to grow in our love for God. Now, the rabbis in the Talmud realized that it's a challenge to try to walk in God's ways and to show love and connect with God, because the rabbis talk about God as, or the Torah talks about God as being a devouring fire. And yet, the rabbis say we show love for God by acting like God, especially when we are loving, when we are gracious, and when we are forgiving. Attributes we give to God, God's self. And so, love reflects love, and love especially leads to actions in this world. And I was thinking about that because, of course, how do we do that? Well, we do that by making God's presence a reality in the world. We do that by choosing actions that really celebrate God's creative power and the things that we see that reflect God's creative power. So we see that in the Torah. The Torah is God's word that gives us a guidance on how to make the world a better place, especially that long section of ethics, Kedoshim, we read only 2 weeks ago. But we also find God's presence in each human being. Each one of us created B'Tselem Elohim. Each one of us created in the image of God. So when we celebrate each other, we are not only showing love for another human being, we're also showing love for God. And that is part of this reciprocal relationship. And then, of course, God is the God creator of all the universe. And so when we look at the world and we find beauty, we are connecting with that presence of God. But when we look at the world and protect the world and help it to be better and to ensure that it's here for our children and grandchildren, then too, we are showing love for God and building at least the potential for that relationship. And it's interesting, when I've often found, and I don't know, is there such a thing as a coincidence? I think not. We had this discussion this morning. That when I'm thinking about something that is important, that I'm thinking about for writing or just studying, suddenly it appears everywhere. So on Friday, when we were studying the brachot, the section of the Talmud on blessings that we've been studying in the Talmud class since the autumn, we got to a page where we were discussing Israel and God's relationship, which is exactly what I was finding in this text already, long before I looked at the Talmudic passage that we'd be studying. And in that passage, it talks about the fact of a reciprocal relationship being equal. That yes, God blesses and makes Israel great through love, but the Talmud said that we too are part of that process, that we make God great in the world. And that was a bit of a question that people were challenged by as we studied it on Friday, because does God need us? How can God be any greater? And the Talmud was saying that what we do that makes God great in the world is we reveal God's presence in the world. And they found it in the very bit of liturgy that I talked about already. They find it in the Shema, that when we affirm God's unity, saying Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, and when we teach that to the world as part of a kingdom of priests, then we are making God great in the world, because we are revealing God's presence in the world. And that's really what our job is as people Israel, is to reveal God's presence and to remind people that God is present in the world. And of course, that leads to all of the obligations that we talked about, finding God in Torah and making Torah reality, finding God in all of our fellow human beings and making that a reality, and finding God in the universe and ensuring that that reality is blessed and beautiful for the present and for the future. And as I was thinking about that, I then came upon another text that reminded me of this same process. And it was the idea that God's most holy name was peace, shalom. And the rabbis there were thinking about the idea that shalom isn't only a word about physical peace in the way that we use it from Pax, but instead, shalom really is a synonym for echad, because shalom means unity. It's a reminder that we are all part of God. It's a reminder that we're all connected one to another, that the whole universe is whole and is God. And therefore, when we build on a world of shalom, we're building on this relationship of love. Now, as I was studying our text for this morning, I hadn't really thought about it, but then I looked at the next verses that come afterwards. And I think verse 13 is as important for thinking about this relationship as the rest that we've talked about so far. So in verse 13 it says, I, the Lord and your God, who brought you out of Egypt, that you should be slaves no more, and that made you walk erect. So God is reminding us that God is our liberator, but God is also reminding us that we need to be standing erect, we need to be standing straight, and that means that we need to be looking at each other in the eye. When we look at somebody in their eyes, that's a reflection of equality. That's a reflection that we're showing respect to that person, but we're expecting that same respect back. It's interesting, in Asia, there's nothing more rude than for a child to look at an adult in the eyes, because that might imply that the child has the same status as the adult. It becomes a problem in schools, especially when Asian kids come to North American schools, because teachers get, stand and look at me in the eye. That's a sign of respect for us, but it's not always a sign of respect throughout the world. But we are told that God gives us this power to look at each other in the eyes, to look at each other with respect, and to, in a sense, be partners in a relationship. And that same text, connected with the verses before, says we need to also look at God and also remind ourselves that we are partners in that loving relationship with God. God walks with us, but we also walk with God. And that leads, in a sense, just to the last bit of the parsha that we have today. And thinking about ourselves as senior partners, in Rabbi Yitz Greenberg's words, before the Holocaust, God was the senior partner, but afterwards we become the senior partner in the covenant. And if we look at all the tochachot and think about them, what does it say about partnership with God? What does it say about love? Now, for our ancient rabbis, reward and punishment was obvious. It worked well, they thought, that when we're good, everything is good. When we're not, everything isn't so good. But as time progressed and people began to really be honest about the world, they realized that it doesn't work so well, that reward and punishment are not as obvious in the workings of reality as one would like. We see good people suffering, and we see evil people having great reward. It doesn't make sense if we think about a system of easy multiplication where A plus B equals C. It doesn't seem to work. Yet, the idea of responsibility is still there, even if the easy reward and punishment is not so obvious. It's a reminder to us that as partners with God, our actions have consequences. We are partners with God when we reveal God's presence in the world. We are not partners with God when we destroy the world. We are not partners with God when we're disrespectful of other human beings. And when we do those kinds of actions, whether we like it or not, there are going to be ramifications. When we destroy the world, there are ramifications for us, and not only for us, but for all future generations of the world. And so, when we destroy a species, there's nothing we can do to bring that species back. When we cause environmental degradation, it's a challenge to try to repair the damage we've done. Now, we can. We did repair, to a large extent, the damage in the hole in the ozone. Maybe that gives us an idea of hope, that yes, our actions have ramifications, but God gives us the power as partners to also do works of repair. The Takein Olam b'malchut Shaddai. In this case, to repair the world in the image of God. We have the power to destroy, and we have the power to repair. And the blessings and the tochachot that we find in this parsha are a reminder that we as partners in a loving relationship with God have that power over the world, and we can bless, and we also can curse. And then, at the very end of the list of tochachot, as Rabbi Roller reminded us, there is a bit of hope. And that hope is that God, and a reminder that God is a loving partner with us. So when we fail, there are going to be ramifications, ones that we really cause. But when we return to God, when we return to the work of repairing the world, then God will be there with us, helping us and walking with us into the future. Shabbat Shalom. We're going to